I'm Sue Bradley and I'm a knitwear designer based in Stroud. I work from my studio at home and I surround myself with yarns and materials and vintage fabrics, and I love to display my work on pinboards so that I'm constantly looking at my inspiration. Perhaps you'd like to have a tour of my studio. My work is very eclectic, and you can see on these pinboards there's lots of different kinds of samples. I've been working on artworks and portraits. These are hand knitted using lots of different techniques and colours, mixing collage with knitting, etc. I've always used florals in my work. This piece is a vintage fabric which I've cut and then collaged on a piece of my knitting. I love working with colour and trying to match in colours and yarns, and textures and things. And these are some of my vintage fabrics I've collected over the years. Paisleys and scarves, things from vintage markets and charity shops. I just sort of constantly change it depending on what I'm being inspired by. I've got a really nice collection of books I've been buying over the years. I've got textile, obviously traditional textile books, old knitting books, and magazines. I love things like Embroidery Magazine and Selvage. I'm always dipping into these for new ideas. And this pinboard shows my work that I do for design companies like Etro and Missoni in Italy. So I work to certain briefs. I do lots of machine knitting. They can give me different ideas of colour they're working on, and I go there regularly to sell my work. The machine knits that I do are highly patterned and decorative. Starting with a colour theme, I then sort of work in more detail and try and work in a kind of group of colours. And I do a lot on the knitting machine. So this is my knitting machine, which is a brilliant thing to use. Works in lots of colours, using lots of different yarns. I use yarn like paint quite a lot, so maybe I'll just show you, give you a quick demonstration. So I've got a piece of work on here now. What's interesting, or it's obviously quite sort of odd, is you're looking at the back of the work. So when you're knitting, you can't see the front, you can see the back, so it's sometimes quite difficult. I work from a software program called Designer Knit. So as I'm knitting across the bed of the machine, this actually goes down like that, each row. It's actually quite therapeutic and quite meditative once you're doing it. I've got some hand knit samples on the wall I've done as well. So I work in a very hands-on way as well as a technical way. I like to sort of mix old and new in fabrics, and I like to mix craft techniques and more technical techniques like machine knitting. And yeah, so I think now maybe I could show you some more projects in detail. I love looking at historical costume for inspiration, and I've done a lot of sketchbooks full of drawings I've done from the Fashion Museum in Bath and the V&A, and I love to look at the detail and the embroidery on them. And here it just shows you some pages I've done. I take photographs and then I draw in detail. I've got books and books full of these ideas. They'll last me a lifetime. I can always go back to them when I'm working on a certain project, finding about a shape or a different pattern on a garment. And this is lovely because it's got all this very detailed black and white embossed work, and different kinds of lace I can look at. Quite a funny thing I do is I sometimes draw upside down. So I look at the garment, I have to go the other side of it because I think you're not really looking sometimes. If you're drawing upside down, you're not looking at it as a garment, you're looking at it as a drawing. So I find that quite interesting. This has got some beautiful gold work on it. You can just see the wealth of ideas there are in one garment. And the great thing about doing study days at these places is that you can select exactly what you want to work with. So I've probably been, I've been going there for about 10 years on and off. This shows you some development where I've looked at my drawings and then I've done some machine knit lamb's wool, which I've then appliqued with lace. I've tied up different bits, made little bobbles, and then I've machine washed it so it felts. So it gives you a really interesting textured effect. But you can see the sort of details have come from the buttons and the pleating and different things in the drawings. I've got another book which I've used inspiration from Elizabethan black work in embroidery, looking at portraits by Holbein and going to the National Portrait Gallery and picking up on details from this vest and the pantaloons, looking at lace and then developing that into a machine knit, which I've then over embroidered and embellished, hand knitting, hand embroidery, machine embroidery, diamante. So it's quite costume-like, but very satisfying to do. And, you know, as I've said, I've just been constantly working on these things for many years. This was a project I did a few years ago and inspired by my mum and dad, mostly my father. And it was for an exhibition called Material Actions, which was all about recycling, upcycling, and kind of the environment. So I realised that I had a lot of my father's old socks and ties that I'd kept from when he died in 1993, and I reused them and made this amazing coat in sort of memory to him. So I started by looking at portraits, beautiful like 1940s portraits. They got married in 1948, and I already had the waistcoat from his wedding suit, which you can see in that photograph. So I started by doing lots of drawings of them, and I did them in quite unusual ways. I did felt pen and things like silver leaf, and used lots of colour. I was trying to get out their sort of their personality somehow. I then decided the way to make the coat would be to do it sort of like painting by numbers, and I did this plastic overlaid drawing, which I then numbered and then cut out all the pieces. It's quite a complicated thing to do. What I love is the sort of challenge where I've never done something before and I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I have to actually work that out. So this just shows you some of the tie, my first sample of one of the ties, cut up, stitched together. And then this is a piece of old tweed from the suit, using hand techniques, trying to work out a way to get the detail into it. And you know, this is the catalogue from the book. It was an amazing project. It took me months to complete, but then, you know, you can't add up all the hours when you're working on something. It's like an artwork. So I can now show you the garment, if you'd like to see the garment, which is over here. And it's a really long piece, and it's got on the back at the top is the embroidery of my mum, and her name's Rosemary. So it's got Rosemary here. The sleeves are all made out of my father's old ties, which have been needle punched, which is a technique, which is a dry felting technique where it goes through a machine with lots of needles which attach the fabric to an underlying fabric, making a beautiful sort of textured fabric. And then down here, the portraits, these portraits of my father. So there he's smoking a pipe and he's got his cigarette there, and people always laugh. I tell the story of how when I was young, we all used to smoke, even when I was about 13, 14. It was just a very fashionable thing to do. So, you know, he had all these different kinds of ties he wore and suits that he wore, and embroidered on it are things that, you know, memories of him. So he bought me a guitar once, so I put the guitar on here. I've got things like, you know, he obviously had a big heart. He gave me a teddy. Got an embroidery of a teddy over there, and I've got his razor. And then another amazing thing was that he actually was one of my hand knit outworkers during the 80s and 90s. So some of the pieces on here, the knitted fabrics, he knitted. So it's completely, you know, wonderful memory of him. And the pipe smoke here is going up in lovely curly hand knit stitches into the memory of my mum. And the other thing was I used his socks. So these are all his old socks that I've cut into strips and then re-knitted and embroidered with things that he used to say. So there's things like my mum's name is there, Rosemary, all hand stitched, and it was just a real labour of love. What does this one say? 40 winks. That was for when you were going to have a little nap. You're going to go and have 40 winks. This is probably one of my favourite projects ever. And this coat's been all over the world. It's been exhibited in America a couple of times, won me prizes. I'll probably never make anything obviously like this again. A lot of my ideas in the past have come and gone, and I've used them again and I've reused them. And something I've always been interested in, going right back to about 1980, is Byzantine enamels and Coptic tapestries and things. And so this is a very recent project where I'm looking at them in more detail. I found it so therapeutic to just sort of find materials and techniques that would fit in with the original pieces. So I start by sketching. So this is one of my recent sketchbooks. So doing it quite roughly, but getting the idea of how I'm going to put the piece together. So in a way, sometimes I draw because I'm trying to think about how I'm going to make something. And then I work into a graph, machine knit graph or a hand knit graph. These are for hand knitting, drawing out the shapes. And I had an idea about making shaped pieces of knitting. And I know that doesn't sound that, amazing, but actually I'd never done it before. And it's quite difficult when you've been doing something for, more than 40 years, which I have, to think of a new technique or something that you've never done before. So I thought I would knit some shaped pieces. So started doing a graph with the edges to follow. And this is the piece that I knitted from that, which I absolutely love. There's just something so lovely about it. And I've done a little bit of embroidery in gold on top of it. And her expression is so sullen, and it is amazing what you can get from knitting, because it's quite I don't know. You just each stitch is each square is a stitch. You're quite limited to what you can do. And then this piece here is one of the. It's just like to knit a circle and then to knit a portrait into the circle and then to do all this detail. You're carrying along, if you're a hand knitter, you'll know, this is like sort of 20 colours going across the back. I have to sew them all in at the end. The back's probably quite a mess, but who cares? And then I've put a frame of bobbles, like hand knitted bobbles all around the edge, bit of embroidery. These aren't finished yet, so these pieces are actually going to go into a bigger piece. So I want to actually connect them and make them fit into maybe metal. And I've started on this one here. I was very excited about this because I found this foil that people generally use for making boxes and embossing into. And I've just sort of used it and drawn in some of the Byzantine patterns with a special tool. And then it stitches. It's amazing. It's actually thin enough to hand stitch through. So I've been able to stitch it in between the knitting. So patching knitting to knitting. And the whole this project really excites me, and this is the way I'm going at the moment, making things that are very much more about an artwork, I suppose. It's sort of a very creative way of working. So although I've made lots of garments and things in the past, I'm really enjoying the freedom of doing this, and reinventing something again. I love being creative and making my own work, but I also love teaching. And for many years I was a senior lecturer at Bath Spa University, teaching textiles, mostly mixed media textiles. So what I do now is I run a variety of workshops. Drawing is really important in my work, and there are lots of ways of drawing. So this shows a workshop I run where you draw using stitch. So using quite traditional hand stitches. On some fabrics are quite traditional, and also playfully on plastic, so it's transparent. Got things like raffia and thick wool and thin yarn going through this plastic. So people can learn to draw using stitch. It's quite an open way of working. Another way of using stitch is on paper. Paper is a very exciting medium for drawing and for stitching. So this is a technique where you lay a paper and then you make it wet and then you wash it away and you get the stitch left and lots of open work. So that's a really good thing to do, exciting. And then this is something where I use plastic, and I've done a portrait on there of my mum. Done it as a freestyle drawing where I've just looked at a photograph and there's no drawing underneath, so I've just done the stitch by hand and through plastic again so it's transparent. So that's the kind of thing I do for drawing, and also fashion drawings. Drawings from things like brooches, blind drawings, quite accurate drawings. Blind drawings are always good fun. It's something you can get quite carried away with. Florals done as a blind drawing, so it's very broken up. Also, you can do it in quite a controlled manner. This is drawn through wax crayons, so you've got a variety of sort of different colours coming through. And then as part of my work, when I'm selling my work, I have to do fashion drawings, and I love drawing faces. I love making them very creative, and these are some examples of things people can learn how to do fashion illustrations. Again, in colour and sort of watercolour and crayon, wax crayon, creating different looks, sort of creating a collection. So these are sort of what I do that works with my knitting. So yeah, drawing workshops are great. Also, I run a variety of appliqué, sort of hands-on, cutting into fabrics, creating different layers. These are all my felted knitted fabrics, stitched on top of each other. This was from an Henri Rousseau painting, the inspiration. You can do that by hand. Some of this is done zigzagged on a machine, and some of it's done just by hand. I've done quite a few workshops in the past for Embroiderers Guild and for the American Museum in Bath and the University of Bath, and sometimes I can do them from my own studio. So yeah, small groups, only small groups. This is lovely because it's my knitting, which has then been appliqued over the top with satin, stitched on quite carefully, and then I've got hand sewing on it, hand stitching, chain stitch, creates quite a lot of texture. And again, working with vintage fabrics, this is an example of just taking an old tablecloth. This is some of my machine knitted lace, which I've then cut out and created a sort of floral imagery on top. And finally, I do an awful lot of hand knitting. I've always hand knitted. I love hand knitting. It's probably one of my best things and my favourite things. And using things like strips of fabric cut up. This is actually a plastic shower curtain, probably sort of 1950s, and different lace. And you can make your own yarn, like I did with my father's coat with his tweed from his jacket and things. So these are things like different fabrics knitted together, tweed fabrics, and then this one's actually more of a colourful version, which is commercial bought yarn and ribbons and beads knitted in. So if I'm doing a workshop in hand knitting, I might think of a theme to work on. Something like landscape is always really good. So things like working from the landscape, doing some drawings, doing some hand knit stitches, and I love working with scales, so looking at large stitches and very, very tiny stitches, and sort of working with maybe collage as well. So that's quite an exciting idea for a workshop where people can play with hand knitting. They don't have to be very experienced. It's just about the colour and the texture and the yarn. So yeah, and that's my life potted, a short version there. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you want any more information, please check out my website. Thank you.